Welcome to the Mobile Workforce Podcast, where we sit down and have real conversations with business leaders that have been where you are. During these interviews, we'll dive into what it takes to improve systems and champion processes that maximize performance. Each week, our trailblazing guests share their experiences and understanding of the workforce to help inspire change, challenge our thinking, and share what it takes to successfully travel the road to profitability. Now here's our host, co-founder and chief evangelist of About Time and WorkMax, Mike Merrill.
Hello and welcome to the Mobile Workforce Podcast, sponsored by About Time Technologies and WorkMax. I'm the host, Mike Merrill, and today we are sitting down again with Cody Rich. Cody is a serial entrepreneur who is the founder of Backcountry Fuel Box and also the Rich Outdoors podcast. And we had Cody on a while back on episode number 37. So if you haven't had a chance to check that one out, I recommend that you go back and give that one a listen. We talked about basically how companies are often getting in their own way and creating their own bottlenecks. So love to have you check that out when you get a minute. But in the meantime, we're going to talk a little bit more about a little deeper dive on some of those same issues. So first of all, Cody's a unique entrepreneur where he loves to hunt. And not only is he good at hunting, but he actually really enjoys it and wants to do more of it. So sometimes he's gone for a month or more at a time, many weeks on end. And so his business has to continue to run while he's away. So that's a great testament to Cody's leadership and also how he's been able to set up systems and processes to help him still remain profitable while not necessarily having to be the guy behind the steering wheel every day. So thanks again, Cody, for joining us and coming back. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be on. I feel like, anytime someone talks about you, there's almost cringeworthy. You're like, oh, am I really all those things? And I would say, I don't know if I'm a great hunter or if I just spend a ridiculous amount of time doing it. So like there's
Both.
like a, I told someone one time, I was like, I don't know if it's about, being a good hunter or even having a lot of time. It's just, I will neglect everything in my responsibilities category until I'm successul. So
there you go. Well, it sounds like priorities, right? That's your priority. Right. So good for you.
Right. Yeah. And it's, we were on, like I said, a while back and got to talk about a lot of those things. And they've kind of been on the front of my mind lately. So I'm excited to talk about it and kind of dive into it. I think for most people, it's like, it's such a reframing your mindset. And it's been so hard. I've worked with a lot of people and, a lot of people reach out and say like, oh, how do I do that? How do I step away or how do I have a no work September? And, a lot of it I do feel like is 100% reframing your mindset. And there's a lot of tactical advice that goes within that as well. And we'll dive into that, but man, you have to even start down that path, you have to reframe your mindset into being like, okay, I'm going to leave in September or whatever month you choose, like mine's a no work September, but
yeah. And I remember on the last episode, we discussed this, but it's like your employees, they need to know you're planning on being gone. Like I will not be here. So now I have to do certain things because Cody's not here to ask these questions, right?
Right. It starts as a joke and then it becomes a threat.
Right. Yeah, I like that. Well, and again, back to why we have you on. Your episode was very popular. A lot of people liked it. I heard even from our internal sales team, other people that are not necessarily running a construction business, but they found it applicable to life. Like, how am I a bottleneck in my own way in my daily life? So, I mean, before we get into some of the more specific points, what bleed over have you seen go into other areas of your life because you have continued to work on sharpening this skill?
Oh man, that's a great question. And it comes from, when I say mindset, you have to get in that mindset of shifting into this like automation, right? And I think once you start doing that in your business, like you start doing it in life in general. And I don't want to be one of those people that just says you got to automate your entire life because like, what's the point of living life? It's like this automation, right? And you're just like going through the flows. But I will say like, you start to prioritize like what's important and what isn't important. And whether it's kids or work or your hobbies, right? Like you have to do those things. And I think the best example of this is like, for me, I spent most of my life trying to automate or systematize my my operations within businesses so I could go do the fun things. But now it's like I can do that to go hang out with my kid, you know? And so for me, it's like how do I take my 2-year old on cool adventures? And those are pretty small, right? But I never want to get to the point where I work too much or there's other priorities over that, right? And so because I've spent, let's say, the last 10 years trying to automate my life to go hunting all the time, now it's actually like I taking a step back, and now I get to automate to spend time with the fam, or teach my kid, or to, make sure that that's at the forefront. So, life is about priorities, and priorities are ever changing or ever evolving, I should say. And so for me, before the podcast, we were talking like, "Oh, did you get a bunch of time off this year?" And I took about 50 days this year to hunt, which is really good, but it's nowhere near what I used to be. Well, a lot of that is because like nowadays, like I can go hunting, but I can also just hang out with my kid or go do fun things with him. I took my 2-year old on like 3 different pack outs, and he's obsessed with hunting, and we spent a lot of time in the woods. But there's also days like, him and I just go to like the rental equipment place and walk around and check out, cool equipment and things like that. So, like once you start down this path of like being able to systematize and automate, um, and building a team around being successful and not just you being, driving the wheel all the time, it allows you to do so many other things. And, for me, a lot of that could be whether it's hobbies like hunting, the kids and priority of family life, but also like being able to move the entire company forward. Like now it gives me time to stop and think. And, that's a huge piece of it.
Yeah, biz dev, like other initiatives that you never could get to because you were too busy in the trenches, literally. And uh, love that. Love that.
Yeah, so many people, I mean, there's like the classic saying, like, are you working in your company or on your company? And like, we're all guilty of this. Like, we all get stuck putting out fires, or trying to keep customers happy or clients happy or those things. And like, I'm not saying that ever goes away. Like, it's really easy to sit on your high horse if you've never done it and be like, oh, well, just automate that, like from the hunting perspective, it's like, oh yeah, you just sit there and a deer walks by. You're like, oh, it's pretty easy, right? Like, no, well, that's not really how it works. And people will argue that within hunting or within business and say like, oh, well, yeah, easy for you to say, but my business can't, or my business can't do this. And like, trust me, I've been there. I've seen a lot of those classic, like, oh, if you just do this, you'll be successful. And you're like, apply it to your business and it doesn't work. Right. And so, it's just like, it's an ebb and flow.
Yeah, so I remember and I don't want to rehash the entire episode from last time, but we talked about giving credit to your employees, basically giving them a line of credit to make certain levels of decisions. I love that. I mean, heard so many comments from people saying, "Wow, I never thought of it like that." It's actually been helpful, and so maybe talk about why that kind of management and leadership is so important, and what it does to allow you to start stepping away and have that freedom that you just couldn't have before.
I always say, this goes into who you hire, how you hire, and this is like why I ask about how deep we want to go into this. And this is something I'm working on currently in my own businesses, and rehashing out and kind of fine tuning and tweaking. But when it comes to employees, like we all tend to think that money is the big driver. Like we just got to pay them enough, and then they'll stay, right? Like it's so cliche, and it's the easy fix for the most part, but it's not really what works, right? It turns out like humans, like, yeah, they may come for good pay or they may stay for good pay, but that's not ultimately what makes them a integral part of a team. Like they need more than that. And it's, I mean, pretty simple human behaviors that they need purpose. They need a reason. Humans or people want to be a part of a team. They want to be a part of doing something cool. They want to be a part of that. They want to feel like they have autonomy and have voice, right? Like these are fairly classic human traits that we all kind of overlook and say, well, God, I just can't afford to have good employees. Like, well, maybe there's other pieces that we could add to this, and not just, how much you can pay. Because at the end of the day, like we've all been there, like you couldn't pay me enough to work for a crappy boss anymore. It's not going to happen. And so like, how do we bring things around the environment to maybe to make up for what we can or cannot pay structurally wise, right? Like, so maybe we can't just afford to pay everyone $100,000 a year, right? But at the end of the day, if you can provide a really good work environment, you can provide meaning and purpose, you can give that person autonomy and make them feel like they're doing important things, then that's when you have like this team building, or you have people who want to stay, right? And so that's like the hierarchy of it. And for me, like the tactical version of that starts out with, they call it the $100 rule. I don't know if it's inflation or what, but I think I moved it to like a $500 rule very
Yeah,
quickly,
right.
because $100 rule is like, I don't know what,
Yeah.
long
Can't
story
buy
short,
lunch
it's
for the crew for $100.
right, right. So when we have someone, when we first hire someone, and I tell them, like, hey, um, I'm trusting you to make decisions. I hired you to make decisions, and so if it's over $100, I trust you to make the decision. This is why it gets quickly moved to the $500 rule, and it's like, okay, if it's under a $500, I trust you to make that decision. And like I just had this conversation with an employee. They like to come to me, and I get that it's kind of a comfort thing, and I'll tease them and not be super hard on them. They're coming to me for answers because maybe they're stuck in their own decision, or they're like between this and that, and so they always come to me, and I'm like, I'm pulling the $500 card here because I was like, I trust you to make that decision. And they're like, yeah, I understand that, but it's choices between this and this. And so like this is where it's like it's easy to say there's a $500 rule, and I think it's a great place to start. It's setting the example, or setting in motion this fact that like, hey, I'm trusting you to make decisions, and that's what you're here for. Like that's why I hired you, is to make decisions. It's very easy for us as business owners, employers, to say like, oh, I need to make every decision, I need to be this integral part. And I think that comes from being supervisors or management in other companies. Like we want to have this value. But at the end of the day, like as an owner, your job is to empower those people. And I think that is huge when it comes to keeping good employees. I don't think you can just pay your way into good employees. If you have a bad work environment, you have, no goals, no anything else, like at the end of the day, like, why are they staying for the 100K, the 200K? Like, and at what point does it stop working because like you just can't keep going higher and higher on the pay? So that's kind of where we have, and this, I think there's a lot of people that have talked about this, but having other reasons outside of that.
Oh, I love, yeah, you tied that all together very nicely. I think, one of the key words that you used, and I subscribe to, is you were talking about how it's empowering to them, which empowering, that really infers growth. It infers progress. It infers that now they are becoming more. So maybe talk about that a little bit.
Right. And I think this goes for anyone who has a super, if you have a super, okay, if to replace me, this often happens with people in construction in a lot of companies, but like to replace me, I need someone so qualified that I need to pay them a lot of money in order for them to not go out on their own. Right. But I don't know that that's necessarily true. We tend to like try to hire ourselves. I think there's a lot of people out there that are more than happy being a number two, because at the end of the day, they can leave the stress at home, at work, and go home, and that's one of the hard parts about being an owner, is that we have to take that stress home. But when you hire a superintendent, or someone at that top level, oftentimes we're only looking at pay. But what happens in my opinion, I think if you can give them, that drive, that purpose, and that meaning in what they're doing, and having like, okay, hey, I'm important, right? Like as stupid as that sounds, like being important matters to most humans, and you can like write that off, but it's very well documented that being or having importance or feeling needed in something bigger than yourself is like that's not nothing. It's worth something. And so I think it becomes very, very important in that role. If you're like bottom of the barrel, having importance, maybe that's something that you look to strive to, but I don't know that you have to have perfect importance for every single person you hire. I think it becomes more important as that tier goes up.
Yeah, that's great. So are there certain things that you look for in employees to attract the right type of people, or are there filters that you run them through, even mentally, before you even consider hiring certain people?
As silly as it sounds, like I go off a lot of gut instinct. And so I would rather have the right person. And I'm always looking at people when I meet people, when I'm talking to people, whether it's a networking or a barbecue or something. Like I tend to look at, those people's traits and not necessarily what their skill set is. Like I would hire for me, I hire for like a personality trait um, or yeah, or over, I would say, specific, like, oh, are they the best at email marketing? Are they the best at this or that? Because I feel like I can train those pieces, the tactical pieces, but I can't train that personality trait, right? That and if I was looking for a number two, I'm looking for that, pleasing type personality that's like they want to do well, they want to be a part of something, and not that ultra alpha, right? The ultra alpha is probably going to go out on its own and try to butt heads with you. Whereas like the pleasing personality, like that's the type of person that is a great number two. And I think if you give them what they need, then they'll give you what you need. And that makes a good partnership in that capacity.
I love that. So speaking of that longer term, like you're talking about number two, what can you do to help a number two stay interested and plugged in what you're doing and helping the business grow without, getting bored or burnt out or moving on to somebody else before you have a chance to really.
Right. I think number twos usually stick around for a couple of reasons. Like usually it's, I mean, pay is there, but I don't think it's the number one. I think they stick around for their purpose as a whole. Like what is the company doing? How is it cool? Do they enjoy what they do? Are they do they feel security? I think security is a big one. If they feel like they're secure and they're in a company that's growing and going somewhere, then they'll stick around, right? If they feel like the company's floundering, obviously they're going to jump ship and go onto a ship that feels like it's excelling or or at least has security, right? And those are like just personality traits within those types of people that I think they're looking for, right? They're not looking for to maybe they want to make more money or a certain income, but they're looking for security, right? Like the best number twos are that's what they want. They want to feel like, oh man, I got a great job and it's going places, it's going things, or it's doing really cool stuff. Like the projects we're working on, I enjoy. So if I'm in a number two and I'm like, man, I really hate doing this project, but I love the fact that like here's what we're building, here's the cool things we're doing, and you can kind of encourage that, right? Like I'm trying to think of a good project, but like if you're working on a project that I don't know, your grandkids are going to see, and like it's going to be a big piece of something, right? That's cool. Whereas the guy, like if you're trying to hire a number two and you're trying to pay him, almost nothing, and he's doing nothing but moving toilets around, then he's probably not going to stick around very long, right? His project doesn't feel cool. So those are aspects to it. So if you don't have the cool factor, you're going to have to pay a lot more. And that's the reality of the situation. So, I think those are just pieces of it, like it's just looking at human traits, but also like looking at those people and saying, okay, hey, like what are your end goals? Like, what do you want? Like, how can I help you reach your goals? Because not everyone has the same goals as you, right? Like my goals maybe be gone all the time. It's probably not wise for me to hire someone whose goals are the same, right? And they're just going to be gone all the time. But if my goals are like, or if the person I hire, the number two I hire, if their goals are like, man, I want a fancy house and a fancy truck, and I don't want to have to worry where my next paycheck's coming from, then I know like, oh yeah, I got you. We can do that. I want to work on cool stuff. I want to build cool things. Like, yeah, let's do that. Like, that's cool. We can do that. And so like just meeting that person in the middle and figuring out what their goals are. Like, you'd be amazed how many people assume goals and or don't ask. Like, it's as simple as that.
That's a great point. So as employers, it's critical to ask your employees, even in the hiring and interview process, and then going back and reviewing regularly, what are your goals? What do you want? What do you expect out of this? Yeah, you're going to get the paycheck as long as you're here and working hard. But outside of that, like what are your long-term goals and plans as an employee of this company?
Right. And I think you have to have the reality that like if their goal is to use you as a stepping stone, that's fine. That's fine. And it may be a 5-year relationship. I think it's easy to get frustrated. Like I have employees like that I know that their goals are bigger than what we're going to have to offer, but I want to be the best stepping stone for them as we can, and hopefully I get a good 5 years out of that relationship, and we're not churning and burning. But I think if you'd be surprised, you'd be really surprised at how many people say, yeah, well, here's my end goal and this is where I want to be. And a lot of people really like security and they have a hard time stepping away from it. And if you offer a really good environment, then you can usually keep them longer than they really wanted to, which I'm not saying like that's a good thing or a bad thing. Like I think it's best to try to help them move to where they want to be. And I think you're going to get the best out of the relationship. And then just, find the next one like that. And I've gone through a number of those.
Yeah, I love that. And it's funny. My experience here in About Time Technologies is very interesting because I started in my early 20s, started a construction company, and the very first employee that I hired was a good friend of mine. Well, he's my partner and the CEO of this software company.
Right.
So
Right.
he was one of my best subcontractors once he went on his own. We did joint venture projects together. So you're not necessarily losing staff to competition. They might be your partner, literally.
Right. Literally. And I'm that way. Like I could think of like the last, at least five people that have kind of used our company as a stepping stone, like still great relationships. I mean, Jaden, like Jaden's and I are really close. And Jaden still does work for me and stuff. And Jaden and I mean, he was like my number two for a long time. And now it's like, he's looking at projects and he's like, hey, do you want to be partners on this? Like, those type of things. And that's just, I think, doing right by people always pans out in the end, but yeah, who am I?
Love that. Well, no, again, those relationships, those opportunities to pull that favor card when you really need some help or to step in. We had, I don't have it up today, but one of our customers, they're called Yeti Welding, and he was a guest on the podcast. Well, I had him make a podcast sign for us, and I didn't have time to mount it this morning, so it's not in the background right now. But anyway, he was telling me all these cool stories how our product is helping his business and how they've increased productivity and they're finishing jobs quicker and they're making more money. Like it's doing everything it was designed to do. He's a small company, but he's getting great benefits. So I said, "Hey, give me the bill for the podcast sign." He's like, "Oh no. That's free." Like, thank you, WorkMax is what he said. So it's like, wow, that's really cool. Like now that relationship is more than just, oh, he's our customer or I'm his customer. It's like we're working together to try and, he said, just put an Instagram post up with my sign and tag me on it and I'm good. So
That's awesome. Well, even better, we just like talked about him on the podcast. So that's
yeah, there
awesome.
you go. Yeah.
But I think, like to circle it back to like practical steps to where to get started. Because like I've been there, I know exactly how it is. Like it can feel like, oh, where do I even, start? I can't afford to hire $100,000 employee and start all these things. So I think, I always say for me, it was a no work September. It started as a litmus test to see if I could do it and to take September off essentially. And I think that's a great litmus test. If you have a different month or if it's 2 weeks, right? Like to take 2 weeks off, I think is a big hurdle for a lot of people. I would suggest a month because I feel like you can neglect for 2 weeks and get away with it. You can't neglect for a month and get away with it, really, maybe. So I do think there's some merit in making it more than 4 weeks or at least 4 weeks. But I would say start with like a 4-week sabbatical, whatever you want to call it. Right. And see if you can get to there, schedule it for a year out and say, okay, what things do I need to have in place to make this work? And if it's a matter of not scheduling a job, that's an option. But you should be able to run those things without you. So if like for 4 weeks, I am not going to be involved. What would have to happen in those 4 weeks for everything to go smoothly without me there? And then start basically breaking it down by category and saying, okay, from the admin perspective, what would need to happen? Like how is payroll going to work? How is, invoicing going to work and all those things? Like those are super easy. And the tools today are just so much better than they used to be. And I think from the admin perspective, like that's just a great start. And all of those tools are readily available to replace you from the admin perspective. And that's an easy one to start with, right? And then, let's say I say product fulfillment, right? And so whether you're a service industry, whether you're, whether you have a product you actually deliver or whatever, like how do we take care of product fulfillment? Because that's like the next most important thing is like we have to actually get our product or our service executed well. And so like what would it take? And then, as you break down these categories, let's say it takes you 2 months for each category to really get them figured out. And now at the end of 12 months, you're like, okay, I'm ready to go on my like first 4-week litmus test and see if it works. And newsflash, it won't, right? Like there's going to be problems. And then you go back and readjust. And that was me for a lot of years. It was like, okay, I'm leaving for September. And I'd get 2 weeks in and then I'd be on the phone and like dealing with problems or, Melissa would call me and be like, oh, the world's on fire. You need to come back. And, and that's just the way it goes. But it becomes a constant, like, how do I keep making this a little bit better and a little bit better each year. And if you really wanted to push it, you could say every 6 months, right? So I got 6 months, I'm going to go on a 3-week vacation. In 6 months, I'm going on another 3-week vacation. And that's a good time to like, okay, how do I get there? How do I align these pieces to make that possible?
Yeah, I love that you're talking about going back and measuring that thing wherever that breakdown was. Like, okay, now I can solidify that and shore that up. And now you're one step closer to having that 3 weeks or 4 weeks off next time without a problem, right?
Right. And I like scheduled tests because what it does is gives you a timeline. I don't think it's not as responsible to say, okay, well, I'm just going to leave, and see what happens, and then I'll fix it when it gets back. There's a lot of truth to that. There was one of my good friends, I might have told you the last time, but he was a plumber, and I remember we went to Alaska, and I was like super stressed about stuff that was going on. I still had a job at the time, and he's like, that all the problems will be there when you get back. Like, you got to just leave sometimes. There's some merit to that. Like, there's the right mindset behind that, but to me, it's like, okay, how do we prep for these things and make sure we're going in the right direction? And because that creates sustainability. That's something we can do more often, whether it's twice a year or once a year. That's something we can actually do. You can only neglect for so long before like those things start building up. And so a on the mindset, maybe a C- on execution. So like that's why I try to like plan them out and say, okay, I'm gone this time. What needs to happen for me to be able to be on?
I love that. I think one of the other things too is what what steps and processes or systems are unnecessary, what are extra, what's fat you can trim off of what you're doing today to maybe alleviate some of those things, right? You have any examples or thoughts on that?
Right. And I mean, that's getting into like the 80-20 principle. And, I think everyone could sit down and run through their own 80-20. And there's a great book on this if you want to read the 80-20 principle. But, sit down and say, okay, what 20% of clients or products are we producing that's creating 80% of our revenue? And what happens because oftentimes this is what it is, like 20% of your clientele is producing 80% of your revenue. And so how do we go and flush out the 80% that's kind of wasted, right? How do we start firing clients? And that sounds really hard to do, but like instead, how do we, let's fire one client and add one more that looks a lot more like our 20%. So like now it's like, instead of like, oh, we got all these clients, and there's 20% of your clients that are eating up 80% of your time. Start firing those clients and start adding clients that, are in the 20 category where, they're the 20% that make up 80% of your revenue. They're the ones that don't have questions, that don't ask for custom. They're the ones that just pay their bills on time, right? Like they're the ones that aren't eating up most of your time.
Yeah, they're not your headache, right?
Right. Right. And that's really hard to do. To be honest, like you're trying to keep everyone happy. But not everyone's the same. Not every customer is the same. Not every client's the same. And I think it's really important to kind of reevaluate your 80-20. And even for us, like in product businesses, right? We could easily say, okay, what 80% of our products or what products in our line are creating more hassle than they're worth, right? Or creating more customer service things. This is often happens is like you'll have a product and you never really notice it, but a product is creating more customer service issues than any other product. And you're like, well, why do like this is, yeah, it's making a good portion of revenue, but it's also creating as much work. So is it worth it? And so repivoting and pivoting your business until you kind of fine tune that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it made me think too. I mean, it's the same with your staff. There
Oh,
are people within your
100%.
organization. I don't care if you got 10 guys or 100 or 1,000. Like there's a percentage of people that are actually holding your business back and slowing you down and getting in the way and muddying up the water for the other nine out of 90%.
Right. And a lot of times, you may have one person that, man, they work really, really hard, but culturally, they're not even like hurting the culture, but they're not moving the culture to the culture you want. Like, right. Like maybe they're the ones that give you a hard time for being gone all the time. And like, yeah, they get stuff done, but they're the guy that's always like, oh yeah, the boss is always gone, always off playing or whatever. Like maybe that's just not a good culture fit. Like it's hard to say, but like that's maybe that's the 80/20 we need to look at reevaluating is like, what's our culture look like? Do we have people that are willing to come to work and are excited about the things we're doing? And maybe that's on, I don't want to put it all on employees, because maybe it's on the founder, maybe it's on my shoes to say like, maybe we're not working on important enough stuff or cool enough stuff to really inspire our employees. And that's a reality, right? And so like these things all have secondary and tertiary effects of like, okay, yeah, maybe I'm cutting this 20% because it's trimming the fat, and these are the products that are really making money. But if I cut the products that the team loves, am I really doing myself a favor? Because now I'm like cutting all this like why for most of our employees, right? And so you got to be cognizant of these things. This is why it's not that simple. It's never black and white, right? It's gray. And so it's important to like, okay, trim the fat, like what products are working well, but it's also important to have a whole picture that inspires our employees and makes them excited to come to work, right?
Yeah, I think we were kind of joking before we started recording, and I made the comment that bosses are people too. But I think that's a two-way street. I mean, we are human. We do make mistakes. We don't always have the best ideas. In fact, if we do, we need better employees, right? So
Right. 100%. But that's kind of my mentality when it comes to like even being able to like do things, right? Like if I'm the best in our company, we got a problem. Like I should have a grasp on everything, but if I'm the best at something, like we got a problem.
yeah, it's a team sport, right? This is not Brazilian jiu-jitsu or karate or, you know.
And I think it's easy to say all this when you're starting a new company. Like if you can build culture around that, I think the absolute hardest thing to do is change a culture, and that's the real struggle. It's like if you've been there, if you've been the guy on the ground, if you were the boss, your identity is outworking every one of your employees. How do you go from that to no work September? And that can be tough. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I for a long time was a workaholic. I took pride in being the first one there, the last one to leave. Like that was who I was. It was an identity thing. And I think that's what I say. Mindset is the hardest thing to shift. I think that's the part in you that you have to shift, is that identity of being the hardest worker on the team to, being able to take time off. Again, I think you can be both. I think you can be the hardest worker on the team. I'm a huge fan of that. Like as much as, people will be like, oh, this guy's just lazy. He goes hunting all the time. Like, trust me, I outwork everyone when I'm here, just not here very much. But, but when I'm here, it's like, I'd rather work, 60 or 80 hours a week while I'm here and then leave for 3 months, or a month or whatever it may be. And, that's just kind of the mentality or the culture you kind of have to set is like, hey, I'm still going to outwork everyone. I'm still going to be the guy that jokes with the crowd, but it's like, hey, when hunting season comes, I'm out, like I'm gone. And, you know, it's not something a lot of people can just do overnight. I think it's something you kind of have to work towards. But like any goal or any, vision of what your company, like for most guys who are employers, like they had this idea for the company, right? And it's not like they created it overnight. Like it was a slow evolve. It chipped away, you chip away. And I think most of us are still doing that. Like I'm not where I want to be. Like I'm still chipping away and evolving. But that's, a part of enjoying the process and not just the end game. That was a huge thing for me. It was like, okay, here's where I want to be. Well, I could work my face off and try to get there, but it may not ever happen. And so part of enjoying the process is like, how do we create a company that I want to be a part of so that when we get there, like I'm still happy, right? And if we don't get there, I'm still happy either way. You know,
You said something there, and I know we're running short on time, but it really just hit me. We need to create a culture as business owners and entrepreneurs that we want to be a part of too.
100%, 100%. And most businesses fail within 5 years. I don't believe that's because there's some run out of money, but I don't believe it's because they run out of money. It's because they run out of like why. They run out of give a damn, right? Like for the most part, you get to a point as a founder where you're like, why am I doing this? This isn't even worth it anymore. And I'm just going to hang it up. Like a lot of businesses are successful, but you just get burnout, right? And I think the best way to avoid burnout is to create a company that isn't focused on the end goal, but it's focused on the journey. And to me, that's a part of like No Work September. Like if I'm in a company that's a No Work September, I'll gladly work my face off for 11 months out of the year.
Yeah, you might get more than a year's production out of that 11 months because you're so driven to get to that time off, right?
Right. And, employees the same way. Like I'm more than happy to let, whoever take, a couple of weeks off and go do what they want to do. And that's like, I just feel like for me, if I'm going to do that, then I would rather provide that too. And just build that culture around that.
Yeah, that's back to you're eating your own dog food there, right? You're setting the culture bar, and then you're also supporting your staff to have some of those same outside pursuits and enjoyments. So that's awesome. Well, man, such a fun conversation. Hell, we're gonna have you back on again down the road.
I feel like we barely scratched the surface there.
We did, but it was good. It's a deep scratch. So tell, I guess, just to wrap up, if there was one parting word, I mean, we talked about a lot of great things, so many nuggets here, but to summarize, what would you recommend? I mean, we're in a new year. Hopefully we're, really poised and ready for busyness and growth that we haven't seen in a while. A lot of pent up projects and pent up people. What advice would you give?
My advice, this may be against New Year's resolutions, but my advice for New Year's resolutions, New Year, New You type stuff is that start smaller than you think and accomplish first. Because so many of us are like, what, this year I'm going to drop 100 pounds, I'm going to grow my income by $100,000. And when it doesn't seem like it's on track, we give up and we fall back. So start smaller than you think and just execute well on the small things.
Oh, fantastic. Well, you're a stud, Cody. Thanks for coming on again. Look forward to doing it again down the road.
Hey, thanks, Mike.
Thank you for joining us today on the Mobile Workforce Podcast, sponsored by About Time Technologies and WorkMax. If you liked the conversation we had today, or were able to learn anything new or helpful, please make sure to follow us on our WorkMax page on LinkedIn and on Instagram at WorkMax_. And subscribe to the show on iTunes or your preferred podcast platform so you will never miss another insightful episode. Also, if you enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating and review and share the show with your friends and colleagues. Your support means the world to us and will allow us to continue providing impactful information with others looking to improve their results in their business and, in turn, their life.